Joel, on another topic, you're in the bear pit. I've got to ask you about this religious bill and the religious freedom. The religious discrimination bill, I think it's called, it remains uncertain, the fate of it, with Labor apparently reserving its position until it's sent to a committee inquiry. Is that just kicking it into the long grass, meaning it won't be dealt with before the election? And do I need to point out that Labor's own election defeat review suggested that it failed to connect with people of faith? Shouldn't you just let this through?
You are right, Cory, about the review and what it said. But it's just the opposite, actually. I mean, Scott Morrison promised prior to the election he'd do something on religious freedoms, and here we are 5 minutes to another election, and it's becoming increasingly clear that this bill won't progress through the Parliament prior to the election. Now, that's a great disappointment, but I'm pleased the Labor Party is taking a pause and allowing the government to set the agenda, because what we don't want, Cory, is to have this very complex and difficult debate in the shadow of a federal election. I mean, we need to ensure that people of faith and institutions of faith have the freedoms entitled to them to practice that faith, to promote that faith, while at the same time making sure people aren't discriminated against on the basis of their sexuality, for example. Now, that sounds easy, but it's very difficult. So now we're 5 minutes to an election. If it's going to take some time in committee to make sure we get this right, and if that generates more bipartisanship than you could expect in the shadow of an election, then that won't be a bad thing.
Joel, I agree with you. This should have been done ages ago, but I still remain unconvinced about whether it's necessary, because once you codify these things, they can become weaponised as well and actually work against people's freedoms. We've seen that in any number of areas. But can I change the subject again here, Campbell? I want to go to Zali Steggall. She's weighed in on calls for a diplomatic boycott of the upcoming Beijing Winter Olympics. Now, she's a Green Left independent. No surprise that she wants to side with Beijing as far as I'm concerned. She won a bronze medal at the 1988 Winter Games, and she says the boycott would be a mistake because shutting the door on communication with the Chinese Communist Party won't resolve anything. What do you think about that, Campbell?
Well, I'm really disappointed that she takes that stance, because if she wanted any credibility on a range of issues, she's really hurt herself. I mean, you can't just ignore what's happening to the Uyghur population. You can't ignore what has been inflicted on the population of Hong Kong. You cannot ignore the encroachment into other countries' sovereign territory adjacent to the South China Sea. These are real issues. And I just say that if she had a sense of history and looked at what happened in the 1930s in a certain Olympic Games that was held in Germany, all the history these days says that it was a mistake for the West, if you like, the democracies, to participate and give Adolf Hitler a showcase of National Socialism. So, I'd ask her to think again. Cuddling up to regimes that have bad track records is not the right way to go. It's not sending the right signal.
Joel, I've got to say that I've come around to this issue. Initially, I thought politics shouldn't, be immersed in sport. But Campbell makes a fair point. Can we afford to ignore what China is doing, A? And B, is fighting it through the sporting arena a wise thing to do?
I completely disagree with Campbell on this one. Never cut off the opportunity to have a conversation, Cory. That's the key point here. And indeed, sport can be a great bridge to healing differences. Now, we can express our concerns about matters in China, including human rights, but you don't progress the conversation if you're not talking. You don't resolve issues if you cut off the dialogue. Now, President Biden had, 3 hours on the phone with Xi Jinping last week. He's continuing the conversation. He's identified the areas where we have differences, and he wants to talk them through in the hope of getting some settlement and improving the situation there. But here in Australia, we're advocating cutting off diplomatic efforts at the Olympics And our ministers here are unable to pick up the phone to senior political leaders in China. They won't speak to us, Cory. You won't resolve these issues if you're not talking. The first thing an intermediary says to you and your foe when there's a bit of a biff going on, can we get together and talk the issues through? That's much smarter than throwing rocks at China on a daily basis, which is exactly what members of the government here have been doing.
But Joel, I mean, it hasn't actually progressed like that, though. You've got to admit that. I mean, you know, the lines of communication have been shut down basically on the Beijing end,
by
refusing to engage with Australian. Well, that is what has happened.
In retaliation,
gentlemen,
Campbell, of some of our ill-considered comments towards China. So instead of having the conversation, we're throwing rocks, and that's been their reaction. This is our largest trading partner.
Don't we have to,
hundreds of thousands of jobs in Australia depend on that trade.
But China's belligerence began when we wanted an investigation to the origins of the COVID-19, the coronavirus.
Well, I would argue against that, Cory, but even if that were true, why did we find it necessary to run out ahead of anyone else in the global community, independently to call for an inquiry, which was always going to happen? We did that to curry favour, political favour here in Australia. And when we did that, Cory, we didn't think about what could be the consequences and ask our barley farmers, some of our coal miners, some of our meat processors about the economic impact that has had on them unnecessarily and, of course, the people they employ.